I want to extend my congratulations to President Bill Clinton on being elected for a second term. I think that President Clinton is a warm friend of Israel and of the Jewish people. He showed that friendship time and again, and the warmth of his feeling is reciprocated by countless Israelis who feel warmly towards the president, and may I add also towards the vice president, who has also been a great friend of the State of Israel for many, many years. We look forward to working with the new old, if you want, American administration on the process of extending peace in our area. We have been doing that consistently over the last few months. We intend to do it in the coming days as well, the coming days, months, and years. We think that an American role is essential. All peace agreements, without exception, that Israel has made with her Arab neighbors have been done with the active help of the United States. And our negotiations with the Palestinians are no exception, as I believe will be our negotiations with Syria once they are resumed. We would like to have the participation and continued cooperation of the United States, and I'm confident that we shall work together in this spirit of understanding and friendship and cooperation to achieve the aim of broadening the circle of peace.
Do you think that there is any danger of Clinton pressuring Israel now, pressuring you?
I think the United States, and President Clinton in particular, has made it very clear that the negotiations have to be conducted by the parties. They will have to live with the results, as the President has said time and time again. And therefore, the U.S. role is one of facilitator and not one of decision maker. It does not make decisions for the parties. It can help, as it is doing now in the negotiations over Hebron. It can help the parties try to achieve an understanding between themselves. That has been the American policy, and I believe it will be. And I must tell you that this participation of the United States, at least in my term in office, and especially in recent weeks, I'm sure has been a very good process by which the United States can truly, from the inside, see who wishes to advance the negotiations and who's obstructing them. I have no doubt that that is fully understood in Washington.
Thank you very much. 1996, Israel. The single most important election for prime minister was commencing, with Labour Party and current Prime Minister Shimon Peres running against a recently burgeoning underdog, Likud Party member Benjamin Netanyahu. More experienced Israeli party members expected Peres, the most unmoved stoic face for Arab Israelis, to win comfortably. As the ending of the election drew near, however, a sudden rise in votes was flooding in for Netanyahu. Those votes came from a very unlikely source, the Jewish Haredi. May 29, 1996, the votes were finally counted, and in the closest race for Israeli prime minister ever held, Benjamin Netanyahu shocked the Israeli world with an election victory of 50.5%, Peres 49.5%. But the Labour Party would still have the majority of the seats in the Knesset, with 34 to 32 seats compared with the Likud. The Arab world was left stunned by the results. Alongside his Likud Gesher Tismit alliance, Netanyahu formed a coalition with the Shas, the National Religious Party, Yisrael Ba'alia, the United Torah Judaism, and the Third Way, with 18 ministers. The demise of Peres can be detailed in the months prior to the election, with tensions rising between the Palestinian Liberation Organization, headed under Yasser Arafat, and the Israeli military IDF, and its domestic intelligence agency, the Shin Bet. The attacks upon civilians grew exponentially in the ensuing months of 1996. Rather convenient, almost. Starting with a suicide bombing and a pipe bombing in the cities of Jerusalem and Ashkelon, ended up with 77 wounded, 25 people killed. The IDF began a severe counterstrike in the Gaza Strip. In April of 1996, Operations Grapes of Wrath, an Israeli military operation carried out by the IDF to end the assault by Hezbollah in Lebanon. But on April 14th, a Hezbollah spokesman told Reuters news agency in Beirut, "We are firing dozens of Katyusha rockets into the Zionist settlements. The northern settlements will be hit continuously and heavily, and we will transform northern Israel into hell." The operation took 16 days to complete. With the United Nations overseeing the escalation, Hezbollah and the IDF began a cooperative ceasefire. In the end, 25,000 Israeli civilians were displaced as compared to over 500,000 Lebanese civilians displaced. Incidentally, the deaths of civilians in Operations Grace of Wrath, and in particular at Ghana, have been cited by Al-Qaeda as motivations for his actions and policies toward the United States of America. Numerous human rights organizations would say that the Israeli IDF committed acts of genocide in Ghana. Growing distrust between formulating inside the Israeli homeland against Shimon Peres, believing he was too lenient when confronting groups like Hezbollah and the PLO. The right-wing Likud Party mounted a political offensive starting mid-year. The Arab minority in the West Bank, however, desperately tried to get Peres enough momentum to counter the growing resentment in the Lubavitch communities. With a new prime minister in Israel, the United States neoconservatives saw a chance to implement a new strategy concerning their right-wing ally and his neighbors in the Middle East. It was here in this document, which saw the beginning of the neoconservative Zionist movement, make a radical change in the geostrategy for the Middle East and Israel. This document, written by Richard Perle, Douglas Feith, James Colbert, Charles Fairbanks Jr., Jonathan Torup, David Wormser, Mayev Wormser, and IASPS President Robert Lowenberg. The document, called A Clean Break, a new strategy for securing the realm. It defined to implement new security strategies for Israel to implement Western ideals for the region. The introduction started out with three new policies. One, rather than pursuing a comprehensive peace plan with the entire Arab world, Israel should work jointly with Jordan and Turkey to contain, destabilize, and roll back those entities that are threats to all three. Two, changing the nature of relations with the Palestinians, specifically reserving the right to hot pursuit anywhere within Palestinian territory, as well as attempting to promote alternatives to Arafat's leadership. Three, changing relations with the United States, stressing self-reliance and strategic cooperation. However, Netanyahu rejected the policy set forth by the plan, but the declaration set forth by the signers, Perle, Feith, and etc., took on elevated positions in the U.S. government and used some of the directives to implement policies in the Middle East years later, during the Iraq War of 2003, headed under the Wolfowitz Doctrine, which later became implemented as the Bush Doctrine. Years later, the directive for the plans to control the Middle East came to fruition, as told by the New York Times reporter Ian Baruma in 2003 in his article, How to Talk About Israel. Quote, what we see then is not a Jewish conspiracy, but a peculiar alliance of evangelical Christians, foreign policy hardliners, lobbyists for the Israeli government, and neoconservatives, a number of whom happen to be Jewish, but the Jews among them, Perle, Wolfowitz, and William Crystal, editor of the Weekly Standard, are more likely to speak about freedom and democracy than about the Hakala, Jewish law. What unites this alliance of convenience is a shared vision of American destiny and the connection that American force and a tough Israeli line on the Arabs are the best ways to make the United States strong, Israel safe, and the world a better place. End quote. By 1997, Israeli spies had slowly infiltrated the military-industrial complex, which had profound effects to its domestic intelligence. David A. Tenenbaum, a mechanical engineer for the U.S. Army's Tank, Automotive, and Armaments Command in Warren, Michigan, had been divulging unclassified documents to every Israeli liaison officer assigned to his workplace over the last 10 years. The FBI said Mr. Tenenbaum had admitted that he had inadvertently given information to the Israeli officers and to Reuven Granot, the scientific deputy director of the Israeli Ministry of Defense. He also admitted that he had been taking documents labeled for official use only and secret to his home. He would not be formally charged with a crime, however, but was instead put on administrative leave. Israeli intelligence spies would also put a tap on Monica Lewinsky's calls to then U.S. President Bill Clinton, listening to sexually explicit calls. After being told by White House aides his calls were being tapped, Clinton told Lewinsky not to call anymore. Meanwhile, Martin Indyk, U.S. ambassador to Israel, would complain to Israeli government about the heavy-handed Israeli spying that existed inside the United States. Israeli-Palestine conflicts continued to rage as numerous attacks by the IDF and Hamas saturated the tumultuous landscape. A Palestinian suicide bomber would kill 49 at a cafe called the Cafe Apropos bombing. This would lead to retaliatory strikes, which killed scores of Palestinians in the West Bank during the 7 months of 1997. Most of them, usually children, were hit in the crosshairs by rifles of IDF soldiers stationed on neighboring rooftops, which predictably led to strikes by the Palestinians in return. This repetitive nature would saturate the region over the years, and in September of 1997, 2 Mossad agents attempted to assassinate Hamas Jordanian branch leader Khaled Mashal in Jordan by way of toxin in the Ziyar Canal. They are arrested, and as are Israeli diplomats trying to negotiate his release, that they must release Hamas spiritual leader Ahmed Yassin and also give the antidote of the toxin to Mashal. Meanwhile, in Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu is under a tumultuous administration. Many Likud members have grown dissatisfied with Netanyahu's decision to implement lieutenants inside the government as he tried to consolidate the Conservative Party in the Knesset. Many in the Likud Party would be wary of Netanyahu during the final months of the year. Netanyahu might survive attempts to oust him in the Knesset. No confidence votes, wrote the columnist Hepmi Shalev in the Mariev. But in terms of political performance, it will be hard for him to function when everyone around him wants his head. Netanyahu's time was running out, but he never wavered, even under heavy scrutiny from the religious sector. Ehud Barak, the leader of the main opposition Labor Party, was Netanyahu's main contender in this election, and he knew he had the backing of the depleted Likud Party, which was thoroughly behind Netanyahu for the last 3 years. The rising death toll and lack of military victory in Israel's long-running operation in South Lebanon had soured voters' support for the Likud Party. And on May 17, 1999, Barak won the prime ministerial election comfortably. His One Israel alliance won only 26 seats, meaning he had to form a convoluted coalition with the Shas, the Meretz, Yisrael Ba'aliyah, the Center Party, the National Religious Party, and the United Torah Judaism. Barak gave a campaign promise to end Israel's 22-year-long occupation of southern Lebanon within a year. The Prime Minister and Defense Minister Ehud Barak appointed on Israeli Public Committee called the Tal Committee, headed by the retired judge Tivazi Tal, to deal with the special exemption from mandatory military service in the Israeli Defense Forces given to Israeli ultra-Orthodox Jews, in which massive protests began almost immediately from the Haredi groups whom protested the decree. The law authorized a continuation of the exemption to yeshiva students subject to the conditions within the law. According to the law, at the age of 22, yeshiva students have a decision year and can choose between 1 year civilian national service alongside a paying job or a shortened 16-month military service and future service in the reserves as an alternative to continuing to study. By then, Barak would continue to make his mark and had the full support of the Israeli public. Netanyahu, however, would continue to work behind the scenes, and the fringe right-wing Likudniks would expound on their relationship with the neocons in the White House by 2000. The politics of both Israel and the United States would witness a more vigorous change never before seen in the world. Their victims, the Arab world, aside from Saudi Arabia and its Gulf partners.